We're watching really closely what's going on, because when the pipeline for the Trans Mountain pipeline is going to be coming into our territory this year, this is exactly how I believe they're going to treat our people. They've said that we've given our consent. They've said bands on the line have given their consent. But what's actually happened is that mutual benefit agreements have been signed with chiefs and communities. And some of those mutual benefit agreements were signed before any of the people even knew that this project was going to be built. And so part of some of those benefit agreements is making sure that our communities don't speak out and speak up. It's also making sure that our communities receive money from the project, but it isn't consent. And so this is a little bit of the same thing that is happening up in Wet'suwet'en territory. And so we're watching closely on the CGL and the LNG process to see how Trans Mountain is going to come into our nation.
I need to ask you if you've ever spoken to Prime Minister Trudeau directly, face to face, about the issue of the pipelines.
Me and Trudeau spoke face to face in 2013. He took pictures with me. He was big on that. He took selfies with all of our elders, and we blanketed him. And he agreed not to build the pipeline. He agreed to recognition of rights and a relationship based on respect. A few other things he said is that when these projects make no sense or they infringe upon our rights, they will rescind them. They also said they would review the laws that complicate things for us when we're fighting for our rights. Right now in Canada, coming into this next year, it's now 2020. It's been several years since I've seen Trudeau. He did not come back to our territory after that meeting, except for a fundraiser last year before the election. I think what's going to happen is that the government of Canada is either going to use the military or the RCMP with force, and they're going to come in and they're going to build all the sections of the pipeline either at the same time or simultaneously, and they're going to oppress our peoples that are on the front line, because our elders council specifically said no. So we have direction in our nation from our elders council to reject and oppose the Kinder Morgan, which is now the Trans Mountain pipeline.
No white supremacists on stolen lands. No white supremacists on stolen lands.
Prime Minister Trudeau actually said to you back in 2013 that TMX was not going to be built.
Yep.
Is that correct?
Yeah. Trudeau said that TMX would not be built. At the time it was Kinder Morgan. One of the things though that he emphasized is that these projects weren't going to go through under his government, that he was going to change the process and that the reconciliation in Canada was going to mean something.
Do you feel personally betrayed on the basis of what he said to you face to face?
Absolutely. Absolutely. He came and he disrespected all of my elders, all of our leadership, and everybody that was in that room that day. He said that this is something that we're going to do and take seriously, and then he never came back to our territory until he was fundraising for his election again.
What happened then?
Well, there was a large protest. Hundreds of people gathered outside of the Coast Hotel where he had his fundraiser, and then hundreds more gathered outside of the university where he had his town hall. And inside the town hall, our people told him he does not have a deed, he does not have consent, and he's going to have to go up against our people if he wants to put this through.
What does that mean, go up against our people? Because now you're looking right down the barrel of that pipe.
Yeah, and so I've asked the tribal council what they're going to do if the pipeline comes through. They said that several, including the tribal chief, said that he would be on the front line right in front of it to stop it. A lot of our elders are ready to be on the front line. So, you know, a lot of people are actually calling it the Standing Rock of the North. There's already tiny houses and people that are up on the line in Blue River. And up in Jasper is the beginning of our territory, but it's also the beginning of our headwaters. And so that pipeline goes right across the Fraser River, and that could devastate the water system all the way through the entire province. And the biggest thing here is that we also have a declaration called Save the Fraser. So more than 50 bands have signed on to an agreement to protect the Fraser River. So there's a lot of implications here all the way around as to who's going to stand up.
It sounds like there's an enormous number of things at stake here.
Yeah. Reconciliation is at stake. There's no possibility to reconcile with our nation if this pipeline goes through. There is the suggestion that by purchasing the pipeline or owning the pipeline, that could be reconciliation. But the reality is the first pipeline that existed was pushed through in the 1950s, when Indigenous peoples weren't allowed to represent themselves in court, when the Indian agent was in control of Indigenous peoples, and when the Indian Act forbid a lot of activities on reserves. So there was no way to fight that original pipeline. That's where they believe that they get the right to do this, because they call it the pipeline right of way, and they're going to build this pipeline right next to the first one. And so the reality is that they think that they have this ability because in the 50s they got that ability from the Indian agent, but they don't have that right. And now that we're talking about reconciliation, now that we're talking about sustainability, we're talking about saving the planet at this point. And Canada is gonna go out of its way to grossly and without any regard for Indigenous rights, put through this pipeline in the name of progress and economic development. And progress in this country is not disrespecting Indigenous rights.
What would you expect or hope for from the settler community?
I think that everybody that is living with us in community, in our house and in our ranch, as we call it as Secwe'pemc people, and in all of the other houses and the ranches of British Columbia, all of us that live together in these communities, we need to stand together because we need to understand what kind of a relationship that we want to have going into the future. 80 years from now, what are our children going to have? We're called, what we call ourselves is the link between 7 generations. And so if this link isn't strong, the next 7 generations will suffer. And so we really need to stand up now so that the future generations don't have to. My dad's been fighting this for 50 years, and so here I am fighting this as well.
You're embarking on something that is truly revolutionary, the Indigenous International Criminal Court. Can you talk to us about that?
So we're going to start an International Indigenous Court of Justice. We're going to look at prosecuting and prosecutorial powers of our elders as justices. And we're going to pilot this, we're going to go through and we're going to see exactly, we're going to address reconciliation, but we're also going to address justice. And so the way that the leadership, right now what's happening is genocide. And so we need to talk about it and we need to talk to our elders. We need to bring those people together to understand genocide and to bring a publication back to the Canadians to understand exactly what it is that we're talking about.
Do you expect to have an international reach with it?
Yes, I do. We have allies in Ecuador, we have allies in Russia, we have allies in countries all around the world who are Indigenous, especially down in the United States of America right now, where they're undergoing a lot of injustices with their people. So we're going to start at home, but we will hope to see what happens with the rest of the world.
I would love it if you could explain to people why the hereditary chiefs are so integral and so important to Indigenous peoples here in British Columbia, and why the elected chiefs are a separate classification entirely. What is the significance and the differences?
So thousands and thousands and thousands of years Indigenous peoples have occupied these lands. The reason that they've been able to live a long time without climate change, without devastation of their infrastructure, which was their homes and their communities, is because they respected the land and they lived in harmony with the land, but they had laws on how they conduct themselves with each other, how they conduct themselves with the animal world, with the plant world, with the earth and the water and the air. And so these laws is what hereditary systems are upheld by. The whole, for my nation, we have family system, which is our family heads. And our family heads, they oversee the process. And we would elect a different chief here and there. In the context of Canadian understanding, we would elect a chief and we would say, okay, we're going fishing, we're gonna elect a fishing chief, and that person has the knowledge. And for some nations, they would go to war and they would elect a war chief. And so leadership was more like popcorn leadership. People would step up at the time and then they would step back because the community was whole. The reality is that with the hereditary leadership today, they're not being respected by the government of Canada and the province of British Columbia in policy, which is the highest form of law in their government. And so the actual process of Parliament and legislature needs to respect the laws of the hereditary chiefs. Elected band councillors and chiefs are accountable to the ministers, and they're accountable under the Indian Act to the Government of Canada. They are elected in by some people in communities, But for example, in my community, it's less than 100 of 500 people. And that can be an entire family that elected somebody in, maybe 2 families, when you have 13 or more families in a community. And so really what is happening across Canada, and when we look at the context of grassroots people, those are the people who are standing up, who are powerless at home, and powerless within their system, and powerless within the Indian Act. A lot of people don't also find their power in the Indian Act, so they empower themselves, and that's what sovereignty is. That's what the hereditary chiefs are taking on, is their sovereign jurisdiction, their sovereign title and jurisdiction in British Columbia.
It sounds like divide and conquer.
Yeah, it's absolutely divide and conquer, because when you have a subset of our nation working towards one goal, and you have the other part of our nation working towards nationhood and sovereignty, recognition of rights, recognition of land title and jurisdiction, you've got the government playing us against each other. And it's really unfortunate, because we don't have, a lot of people want us to deal with this internally inside of our systems, but when we deal with it internally inside of our systems, we're all pitted against each other right from the beginning. So it's a lot of fighting happening when you've got different negotiations, different agreements, different community goals, different community values. And for our people, we were nomadic people anyway, so the reserve system is just about putting us in one spot and not allowing us to move around.
No access, no consent. No access, no consent. No
Sovereignty is about your right to govern yourself. So self-governance in this country, and the way that, in the context that it's spoken about in politics and in media, is not the same self-governance that's been handed down to us as Indigenous peoples. The inherent self-governance that we have is right here in our hearts, and we walk in a good way. See, when we talk about it takes a community to raise a child, when that child grows up to a certain age, that child goes out and does their passage of rites, and they do their ceremonies, and they become connected to the land and connected to their community and connected to each other. They can be trusted to walk in a good way, and they carry that self-governance inside. That's sovereignty for Indigenous people. It's about walking in your own strength and walking your path with integrity and with dignity and with belonging. In our nation, our elders say that we're a dream of the land itself. We came from the land, we came from the animals, we came from the plant world. My traditional name is Musumno Asaninapel. That is in Cree, because that's where I went and I did my ceremony. And I have roots in the Cree Nation as well. And Musumno Asaninapel means grandfather round rock. And I asked myself, what does that mean as a sovereign? What does it mean to stand in that and to truly understand it? But the elders said that means the circle of life. It means that all of you are one of you, and you're all together as one. So I take my sovereignty seriously. I understand my ability to connect with the land, to connect with other people. And sovereignty and ceremony is so important. That's how come the throne speech that was interrupted was such a historical day for people, because without ceremony, it's just a speech. Indigenous peoples are saying, wait a second, we were the ones who've been here for thousands of years. We're the ones who protected the land, and now we're seeing climate change. So we're also saying that we need to continue to protect the land, that our laws are paramount, or else the human species will not survive.